The Tale of Mrs Tittlemouse by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time there was a wood mouse, and her name was Mrs Tittlemouse. She lived in a bank under a hedge. Such a funny house. There were yards and yards of sandy passages, leading to storerooms and nut cellars and seed cellars, all amongst the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen, a parlour, a pantry, and a larder. Also, there was Mrs Tittlemouse's bedroom, where she slept in a little box bed. Mrs Tittlemouse was a most terribly tidy, particular little mouse, always sweeping and dusting the soft, sandy floors. Sometimes a little beetle lost its way in the passages. "Shoo, shoo, little dirty feet," said Mrs Tittlemouse, clattering her dustpan. And one day a little old woman ran up and down in the spotty red cloak. "Your house is on fire, Mother Ladybird. Fly away home to your children." Another day a big fat spider came in to shelter from the rain. "Beg your pardon, is this not Miss Muffet's?" "Go away, you bold bad spider, leaving ends of cobwebs all over my nice clean house." She bundled the spider out at the window. He let himself down the hedge with a long thin bit of string. Mrs Tittlemouse went on her way to a distant storeroom to fetch cherry stones and thistledown seeds for dinner. All along the passage she sniffed and looked at the floor. "I smell a smell of honey. Is it the cowslips outside in the hedge? I am sure I can see the marks of little dirty feet." Suddenly, round a corner, she met Babbitty Bumble. "Zzz, bzz, bzz," said the bumblebee. Mrs Tittlemouse looked at her severely. She wished that she had a broom. "Good day, Babbitty Bumble. I should be glad to buy some beeswax, but what are you doing down here?" "Why do you always come in at a window and say zzz, bzz, bzz?" says Mrs Tittlemouse began to get cross. "Zzz, whiz, whiz," replied Babbitty Bumble. In a peevish squeak, she sidled down a passage and disappeared into a storeroom, which had been used for acorns. Mrs Tittlemouse had eaten the acorns before Christmas. The storeroom ought to have been empty, but it was full of untidy, dry moss. Mrs Tittlemouse began to pull out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees put their heads out and buzzed fiercely. "I am not in the habit of letting lodgings. This is an intrusion," said Mrs Tittlemouse. "I will have them turned out." Buzz, buzz, buzz. "I wonder who would help me." Buzz, whiz, whiz. "I will not have Mr Jackson. He never wipes his feet." Mrs Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees till after dinner. When she got back to the parlour, she heard someone coughing in a fat voice, and there sat Mr Jackson himself. He was sitting all over a small rocking chair, twiddling his thumbs and smiling with his feet on the fender. He lived in a drain below the hedge, in a very dirty, wet ditch. "How do you do, Mr Jackson? Dearie me, you have got very wet." "Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mrs Tittlemouse. I'll sit a while and dry myself," said Mr Jackson. He sat and smiled, and the water dripped off his coat-tails. Mrs Tittlemouse went around with a mop. He sat a while that he had to be asked if he would take some dinner. Firstly, she offered him cherry stones. Thank you, Mrs Tittlemouse. No teeth, no teeth, no teeth," said Mr Jackson. He opened his mouth most unnecessarily wide. He certainly had not a tooth in his head. Then she offered him thistledown seeds. "Tiddly, widdly, widdly, poof, poof, puff," said Mr Jackson. He blew the thistledown all over the room. Thank you, Mrs Tittlemouse. Now, what I really, really should like would be a little dish of honey." "I'm afraid I have not got any, Mr Jackson," said Mrs Tittlemouse. "Tiddly, widdly, widdly, Mrs Tittlemouse," said the smiling Mr Jackson. "I can smell it. That is why I came to call." Mr Jackson rose, ponderously from the table and began to look into the cupboards. Mrs. Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe his large wet footmarks off the parlour floor. When he had convinced himself that there was no honey in the cupboards, he began to walk down the passage. Indeed, indeed, you will stick fast, Mr. Jackson. Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse. First he squeezed into the pantry. Tiddly widdly widdly. No honey, no honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse. There were 3 creepy-crawly people hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them got away, but the littlest one he caught. Then he squeezed into the larder. Mrs. Butterfly was tasting the sugar, but she flew away out of the window. Tiddly widdly widdly, said Mrs. Tittlemouse. You seem to have plenty of visitors. And without any invitation, said Mrs. Thomasina Tittlemouse. They went along the sandy passage, tiddly widdly, buzz whiz whiz. He met Babbity round a corner and snapped her up and put her down again. I do not like bumblebees. They are all over bristles, said Miss Jackson, wiping his mouth with his coat sleeve. Get out, you nasty old toad, shrieked Babbity Bumble. I shall go distracted, scolded Mrs. Tittlemouse. She shut herself up in the nut cellar while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He seemed to have no objection to stings. When Mrs. Tittlemouse ventured to come out, everybody had gone away. But the untidiness was something dreadful. Never did I see such a mess. Smears of honey and moss and thistledown and marks of big and little dirty feet, all over my nice clean house. She gathered up the moss and the remains of the beeswax. Then she went out and fetched some twigs to partly close up the front door. I will make it too small for Mr. Jackson. She fetched soft soap and flannel and a new scrubbing brush from the storeroom, but she was too tired to do any more. First she fell asleep in her chair. Then she went to bed. Will it ever be tidy again? Said poor Mrs. Tittlemouse. Next morning she got up very early and began a spring clean, which lasted a fortnight, 2 weeks. She swept and scrubbed and dusted, and she rubbed up the furniture with beeswax and polished her little tin spoons. When it was all beautifully neat and clean, she gave a party to 5 other little mice without Mr. Jackson. He smelt the party and came up the bank, but he could not squeeze in the door. So they handed him out acorn cupfuls of honeydew through the window, and he was not at all offended. He sat outside in the sun and said, Tiddly widdly widdly, you're very good health, Mrs. Tittlemouse. Who does Mrs. Tittlemouse first find in her house? Who did she finally find living in one of her storerooms? And how long does it take for Mrs. Tittlemouse to clean? The end.